Sometimes it doesn't take a war, a treaty, or years of diplomacy to change the way the world sees itself. Sometimes it takes just one question, one answer, and one man who refuses to bow down to pressure. What if I told you that in a single moment, inside a university hall in America, India's voice shook the very foundation of Western arrogance and reminded the world that the era of silence is over? Have you ever witnessed a moment so sharp, so direct, and so brutally honest that it froze an entire room, leaving every person in stunned silence? Imagine it. A young American student rises with confidence, convinced she's about to outsmart one of the sharpest diplomats alive. She frames her question with a tone of superiority, certain she has the truth on her side, expecting India's Foreign Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar to hesitate or stumble. But within seconds, the energy in the hall shifts. What began as an innocent question quickly turns into the setup for one of the most powerful reality checks ever spoken in global dialogue. This was not simply an exchange between a minister and a student. It was something much bigger. It was about how the balance of power across the globe is shifting in today's world. It was about how nations that were once considered developing or secondary are no longer willing to be lectured to by the so-called advanced nations of the West. And above all, it was about how India, through the words of Dr. Jaishankar, made it crystal clear that the time of one-sided stories and imposed morality has ended. Now, before I describe the moment that left the American student visibly shaken, let me paint the picture. The event was a prestigious Q&A session held at a well-known university in the United States, a place that prides itself on free speech, a place where students are trained to ask challenging questions, yet also a space where the Western worldview dominates, shaping young minds to believe that their perspective is the only valid one. Into this stage walked Dr. Subrahmanyam Jaishankar, India's External Affairs Minister, respected across the world for his razor-sharp intellect, calm presence, and unmatched ability to cut through diplomatic fog with direct, undeniable truths. The American student, full of confidence in her familiar environment, asked a question that echoed the quiet doubts and criticisms many in the West have whispered for years. Her words carried a subtle arrogance, wrapped in the language of democracy, human rights, and global responsibility. On the surface, it looked like a genuine question, but if you read between the lines, it wasn't really a question at all. It was a hidden accusation aimed straight at India's choices, its partnerships, and its policies in a complicated and divided world. At that point, the tension rose. The entire audience expected Jaishankar to respond like most diplomats would, with carefully chosen words, soft language, and a polished reply that avoided offense. But that is not Jaishankar's way. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, adjusted the microphone, fixed his gaze directly on the student, and delivered what can only be described as a devastating truth bomb. His statement was so blunt and so piercing that its effects are still being discussed around the world today. He declared with clarity, "You do not get to sit thousands of miles away and preach morality to us when your own record is written in wars, invasions, and double standards. You ask me why India takes a particular path. The answer is simple: because we refuse to be victims of someone else's history." The entire hall went silent. The confident look on the student's face faded into visible discomfort. At first, a few people clapped softly, unsure of the moment. Then, applause grew louder and stronger, carrying with it a sense of relief and recognition. But that was not the end. Jaishankar did not stop with one powerful line. He continued, exposing the hypocrisy deeply embedded in Western rhetoric. He reminded them that the United States questions India on democracy, while it openly partners with governments notorious for abuse and authoritarianism. He pointed out how wars in the Middle East, which destroyed countless lives, are explained as fights for freedom, yet when India takes steps to protect its own sovereignty, it is labeled as questionable. He reminded the room that during the Cold War, Western powers treated India as a pawn, And now, when India chooses to rise and act independently, suddenly accusations of morality and values appear. Then came the masterstroke, the final words that ended the debate once and for all. He stated clearly that the time when a handful of countries could dictate rules to the world while everyone else obeyed in silence is over. This is no longer the 20th century. He said with confidence that India will follow its own interests without apology. Those words carried an enormous weight. They were not meant only for the young student sitting in that auditorium. They were directed at the entire world. This moment was more than an exchange during a university event. It was a declaration that India will no longer play the role of a quiet observer on the world stage. Through voices like Jaishankar's, India is stepping forward with confidence, speaking truths that many powerful nations would rather keep hidden. That is why the clip of this moment spread across the internet so quickly. It was not only dramatic, it was authentic. People from Asia, Africa, and Latin America saw themselves in his words. They too are tired of being lectured, tired of hypocrisy, and tired of being judged by countries with histories marked by war, colonization, and exploitation. In Jaishankar's reply, they did not just hear India's voice, they heard the voice of the broader global South finally pushing back. The irony cannot be ignored. American foreign policy has for decades been built on interventions, from Vietnam to Iraq, from Afghanistan to Libya. Yet when India decides to purchase oil from Russia, suddenly it becomes a moral issue. When India builds up its defense, it is turned into a global concern. The hypocrisy is clear, and Jaishankar exposed it fearlessly in front of a live audience without hesitation. The student thought she had asked a bold question, but in reality, she had handed Jaishankar the perfect opportunity to dismantle decades of Western arrogance in less than 5 minutes. And let me be clear, this was not just about India and America. This was about the larger global order. For centuries, the West controlled stories and perceptions through its media, its universities, and its diplomacy. But in that one moment, Jaishankar made it clear that the world is changing. Former colonies do not need approval from their colonizers anymore, and the classrooms of Harvard, Princeton, or Georgetown no longer have the authority to define what is right for the rest of the planet. If you think this was a rare occurrence, you are mistaken. Jaishankar has repeatedly given such unfiltered reality checks in interviews, press briefings, and international conferences. He has become the symbol of unapologetic Indian diplomacy. Remember when he was asked about India purchasing discounted oil from Russia? His response was short and firm. "My job is to secure the best deal for my people. If Europe can prioritize its own energy needs, why can't India?" That was another undeniable truth bomb. Or recall when Western journalists questioned India's democracy. His reply was again direct. "We are not sitting in judgment of others, and we expect the same courtesy in return." That line carried the same force. Every time he speaks, the message is the same. India is not a supporting character in another nation's story. India is writing its own story. Now, think about the state of mind of that young student after hearing those words. She came prepared with what she thought was sharp intellectual ammunition, but instead of exposing Jaishankar's weaknesses, she ended up exposing her own lack of understanding. That is the real truth bomb. The Western narrative no longer stands strong when faced with facts, history, and the courage to speak openly. What Jaishankar did in that moment went beyond politics. It was psychological. He flipped the script. Normally, it is the student or the journalist who corners leaders with challenging questions. But here, the leader cornered the questioner. The balance of power shifted instantly, and once that change took place, there was no way to go back to the old order. That is why this moment matters so much. It was not just a win for Jaishankar or for India. It was a defining signal for the entire global South. For many decades, countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America have felt trapped under Western narratives. They were told how to govern, how to trade, how to think, even how to live their daily lives. But now, these nations are beginning to discover their own voices, and India, with its growing economic strength and rising strategic weight, is leading this wave of pushback. So the real issue is not simply whether Jaishankar silenced an American student with a powerful truth bomb. The deeper question is what this moment reveals about the future of global politics, and even more importantly, what it means for everyday people like us. That is where the story becomes truly fascinating. In the next part, we will explore the ripple effects of this exchange, the lessons it holds for the West, and why Jaishankar's words are likely to echo for decades to come. But before closing this first part, let me leave you with one thought. When history is written, moments like these, seemingly small but massive in their effect, are remembered as turning points. That day, in that hall, with that single question and that piercing response, the world witnessed the end of one era and the start of another. The age of lectures is ending. The age of dialogue is beginning. And India, through Jaishankar, is no longer politely requesting respect. It is demanding it. But friends, we cannot stop at that one fiery exchange. Because the truth is, Jaishankar's words that day were not just a clever reply. They were the expression of a whole philosophy, a complete strategy that India has been carefully building for years. To understand why that moment cut so deeply, we must step back and see the bigger picture. For decades, global politics was controlled by a few powerful nations. They decided who was right and who was wrong, who was democratic and who was authoritarian, who deserved sanctions and who deserved support. They held the moral microphone, and the rest of the world had no choice but to listen. But today, that balance is shifting, and India is right at the center of this change. When Jaishankar spoke, he was not just defending India's decisions, he was giving voice to the frustrations of dozens of nations, tired of hypocrisy. Look at Africa, where Western nations extracted resources for centuries and then turned around to lecture about sustainability. Look at Latin America, where foreign-backed coups and interventions left entire regions unstable, yet the same nations still hand out sermons about governance. Look at the Middle East, where wars fought in the name of democracy left behind broken societies and endless conflict. And then look at South Asia, where India has endured hardships but never bent down, refusing to surrender its sovereignty. That student probably believed she stood on higher moral ground, but what she didn't realize was that her question was only a mirror reflecting the arrogance the world is rejecting. And with blunt honesty, Jaishankar lifted that mirror back to her face. Now, let us look at the ripple effects of that moment, because words may appear to be just words, but in the world of geopolitics, they can move mountains. First comes the psychological impact. Imagine being a policymaker in Washington, used to Indian leaders politely nodding, choosing every word carefully, always avoiding offense, and suddenly here stands a man who doesn't just push back, but tears apart your argument in front of your own citizens. That changes perception. It forces respect. And in diplomacy, respect is everything. Second comes the global impact. Videos of Jaishankar's exchange spread like wildfire on social media. Millions watched, and among them were young people from Asia, Africa, and Latin America who suddenly felt represented. They saw in his calm yet firm answer a reflection of their own anger at double standards. They thought, finally, someone is daring to say this openly. That creates solidarity. That builds momentum. Third comes the domestic effect inside India. Ordinary Indians saw their foreign minister refusing to be talked down to, refusing to play second fiddle. That sparks national pride. It tells every citizen, your voice matters, your nation matters, you are no longer an afterthought in history. But here lies the key point. When Jaishankar speaks like this, he is not just challenging the West. He is redefining what diplomacy can mean today. For far too long, diplomacy was seen as polite words, endless compromises, and carefully polished statements. Jaishankar has shown that diplomacy can be sharp, straightforward, and still highly effective. In fact, sometimes blunt honesty is the strongest weapon of all. And this is why leaders across the world are paying attention. Because Jaishankar has shaped a new model, one that could be called assertive diplomacy. It is a model where you don't beg for approval, you don't keep defending yourself, you don't apologize for protecting your interests. Instead, you speak your truth clearly, back it with evidence, and stand firm without hesitation. That is the kind of diplomacy that connects in today's multipolar world. Now let us return to that brutal truth bomb itself. What made it powerful was not only the words, but also the context. Think of the hypocrisy he exposed. The West criticizes India for buying Russian oil, while Europe itself continues importing Russian gas. The West questions India's democracy, yet happily embraces governments where dissent is crushed. The West criticizes India for guarding its borders, while justifying its own invasions as national security. Once those contradictions are revealed, the entire narrative falls apart. And that is exactly what Jaishankar did. He dismantled the narrative. He forced everyone in that hall and everyone watching online to face a truth they did not want to see. The moral authority of the West is no longer beyond challenge. Now imagine the silence in that room. Imagine the discomfort on the student's face. Imagine the realization in the audience that the old playbook no longer works. That was the true force of the truth bomb. But here's the interesting part. It was not a one-time event. Again and again, Jaishankar has delivered such moments. Whether in Munich, New York, Delhi, or in interviews with Western journalists, he has stayed calm, precise, and devastatingly honest. And each time the message is the same. India is not here to please others. India is here to defend its interests, uphold its values, and shape its own destiny. This is why I say it was more than a Q&A exchange. It was a sign of a much bigger shift in global power. The world is no longer unipolar. It is no longer dominated by one or two voices. It is multipolar, diverse, and complex. And in such a world, the West's monopoly on morality is finished. Friends, let's put it simply. The American student's question was not only answered, it was demolished, dismantled, reduced to dust. And in its place, Jaishankar built something new, a voice of confidence, a voice of independence, a voice that will guide India and perhaps much of the global South into the future. So what does this mean for you and me? It means we are living through a turning point in history. The rise of India is not only about its economy, its technology, or its population. It is about voice. It is about reclaiming dignity on the world stage. And Jaishankar's truth bombs are part of that reclamation. This is why his words matter. This is why this exchange matters, because it tells every Indian, every Asian, every African, every citizen of the world, you no longer have to accept double standards. You no longer have to bend to false stories. You can speak the truth. And when you do, the world will listen, even if it listens in silence, even if it listens uncomfortably. As we approach the conclusion of this story, let's widen the frame one last time. That American student may have asked the question, but in reality, she stood as a symbol of something larger, the arrogance of a system convinced it could never be questioned. And Jaishankar's reply was not only for her, it was for that entire system. It was a message. The days of lectures are over. The era of dialogue has started. And make no mistake, this is just the beginning. As India grows stronger, and as the nations of the global South find their voices, more truth bombs will be dropped. And with everyone, the world will tilt further away from dominance and closer to balance. That day in that hall, something powerful happened. An American student asked a question, but what she received was not simply an answer. It was a revelation that cracked her assumptions, a revelation that echoed across continents, a revelation destined to be remembered as one of the defining moments of modern diplomacy. And that revelation was clear. Truth cannot be monopolized. It can be hidden for a time, It can be twisted for a time, but eventually it breaks free, and once it does, it cannot be stopped. That is what Jaishankar reminded the world. That is why his words struck like a brutal truth bomb. Years from now, when people reflect on India's rise as a global power, they will not remember only the policies, the trade deals, or the military build-up. They will remember the words. They will remember the confidence. They will remember the day when India's voice shattered arrogance and declared without fear that the future belongs to those who speak truth without hesitation. And as long as voices try to dominate, there will be truth bombs to bring them down. As long as leaders like Jaishankar stand tall for nations that refuse to be silenced, the world will keep transforming. One exchange, one truth, one act of fearless honesty at a time.